Today, we're diving into a full-blown investigation of what is easily one of the most seismic geopolitical earthquakes of the 20th century. We are looking at the total collapse of a true global titan. I mean, picture this: a sprawling transcontinental empire with a massive command economy, a frankly terrifying nuclear arsenal, and the space program that literally made history. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, it just vanishes. For nearly 70 years, the Soviet Union challenged America for global dominance. Then, in just a few dramatic years, one of the world's greatest superpowers disappeared. It's the ultimate historical mystery, right? How does an invincible, heavily armed empire basically die overnight? Well, in this explainer, we're going to find out. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's the roadmap for our investigation. We'll start with the rise of a superpower, move into the era of stagnation, look at cracks in the foundation, examine the desperate reforms, track the final days, and finally look at a new global map.
Chapter 1. Rise of a Superpower. From Revolution to Cold War Titan.
You know, to really understand the fall, you first have to wrap your head around the sheer scale of the peak. This story kicks off in the ashes of the 1917 Russian Revolution. By 1922, the Soviet Union was officially on the map, and they achieved something genuinely staggering. They took a largely backward agrarian society and rapidly transformed it into a heavily industrialized powerhouse. After playing a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany in World War II, the USSR stepped onto the stage as an absolute global hegemon. They built a nuclear arsenal that went toe-to-toe with the United States, they put the first human into space, and they firmly established a bipolar world order. This, of course, locked the West into the Cold War, a decades-long standoff characterized by the constant, looming threat of mutually assured destruction. Outwardly, the Soviet Union projected this aura of total invincibility. It seemed permanent.
Chapter 2. The Era of Stagnation. The Hidden Rot Beneath the Surface.
And this brilliantly illustrates a massive contradiction that popped up during Leonid Brezhnev's leadership from the 1960s to the 1980s. On one hand, you had the government's absolute obsession: colossal military budgets, thousands of nukes, and dominance in the space race. But contrast that with the grim, exhausting daily reality for everyday citizens. The command economy was severely failing its people. Basic consumer goods were just gone. You'd have everyday people spending hours waiting in freezing bread lines, just hoping to secure a pair of winter boots or basic food staples for their families. It was a life completely defined by shortages. And shockingly, the demographic trends were going backwards. Male life expectancy actually plunged from 67 years down to 62. To just survive, people were forced to rely on these massive illegal black markets. There was this incredibly cynical quote from the era: "We pretend to work while you pretend to pay us." It hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? The social contract was just completely shattered. With absolutely nothing to buy in the stores and living under heavy state censorship, rampant absenteeism and severe alcoholism just plagued the workforce. The state was busy artificially inflating production numbers just to meet these ridiculous ideological quotas, but the actual economic core was rotting away. The empire was physically collapsing under its own weight from the inside out, way before the rest of the world ever even noticed. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Foundation. 3 Devastating Blows. So moving into the late 1970s and 80s, this already fragile system gets pushed straight to the edge. 3 massive shocks hit in rapid succession. First up, the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan. What was supposed to be this quick in-and-out stabilization mission morphed into a bloody, unwinnable 10-year stalemate. It bled billions of rubles from the economy, but more importantly, it sparked unprecedented internal anger. Mothers of dead soldiers actually began openly protesting the agonizing human toll. Second, a massive macroeconomic gut punch. Between 1982 and 1986, global oil prices cratered, dropping from $76 a barrel down to just $20. Now, oil exports were the main source of hard currency, keeping the Soviet economy afloat, so this price crash practically wiped out their state revenue overnight. And finally, 1986, the tragic Chernobyl nuclear disaster. This horrific accident, compounded by the state's clumsy, desperate attempts to cover it up, completely shattered whatever tiny bit of public trust was left. It brutally exposed the disastrous flaws of a highly corrupted, top-down bureaucracy. Now, compounding all these internal disasters was some really intense external pressure. During the 1980s, the United States, under the Reagan administration, massively ramped up defense spending. This included the Strategic Defense Initiative, which famously got dubbed Star Wars.
The Soviets, who were already starved for cash, looked at these American technological leaps with mounting dread. They were trying desperately to keep pace in a ridiculously expensive arms race. Now, to be clear, historical scholars largely agree that while this American military pressure made the crisis much worse, it wasn't the sole cause of the collapse. The Soviet Union's underlying structural flaws were already steering it toward economic ruin anyway, but the arms race undoubtedly squeezed a system that had absolutely zero breathing room left.
Chapter 4. The Desperate Reforms. Gorbachev's Doomed Gambit. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev took power as General Secretary in 1985, the crisis was impossible to ignore. Gorbachev was a reformer. He looked at the bloated communist bureaucracy and realized that if they were going to survive, they needed immediate, desperate changes. So he introduced two landmark policies. First was glasnost, which translates to openness. This allowed for increased political transparency, actual freedom of speech, and a loosening of all that strict press censorship. Second was perestroika, meaning restructuring. This was aimed at decentralizing the rigid command economy and actually introducing some elements of market competition. And it is absolutely crucial to understand Gorbachev's mindset here. He intended for these policies to save the socialist system, not destroy it. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the unintended consequences. By lifting that heavy boot of state suppression, Gorbachev accidentally opened up a total Pandora's box. The newfound freedom of speech allowed decades of suppressed ethnic tensions and anti-Soviet grievances to just explode out into the open. We all saw the physical manifestation of this global shift when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, which basically collapsed Soviet influence across Eastern Europe overnight, but internally across the Union's 15 diverse republics, a true parade of sovereignties began. This whole movement was spearheaded by the Baltic states, places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, who boldly stepped up and demanded full independence from Moscow. So the very reforms that were designed to save the empire were the exact things pulling it apart. Chapter 5. The Final Days. The Rapid Collapse of 1991. At this point, the slow decay suddenly turned into a frantic, completely uncontrollable freefall. Let's track this dizzying final timeline. In August 1991, communist hardliners attempted a military coup against Gorbachev. They wanted to reverse his reforms and forcibly save the old system. Well, the coup failed spectacularly, but it entirely paralyzed Moscow and elevated a new, incredibly popular political figure, Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic. Over the next few months, seeing just how weak the central government had become, Soviet republics rapidly declared independence like falling dominoes. By December, the Union was basically in tatters, leading to a secret meeting on December 8th, and ultimately, Gorbachev's truly historic resignation on Christmas Day. Let's look a little closer at that pivotal December 8th meeting, because it is wild. Deep in a hunting lodge in the Belovezh forest, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, which were the three founding republics of the Soviet Union, met in total secrecy. Bypassing Gorbachev completely, they signed a pact boldly declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist as a subject of international law. They replaced the whole Union with a loose coalition called the Commonwealth of Independent States. This was it. This was the legal death blow. When Gorbachev resigned on December 25th, and that iconic Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the very final time, he was resigning from a country that practically no longer existed.
Chapter 6. A New Global Map. The Aftermath of December 26.
The very next day, the Soviet Union was formally voted out of existence, and the world would never be the same. 15. That is the number of independent nations that instantly emerged from the collapse, from Ukraine and Belarus in the west, stretching all the way to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in Central Asia. The global map was completely redrawn overnight. The long-term impacts of this were just monumental. Geopolitically, the Russian Federation emerged as the recognized successor state. They inherited the Soviet UN Security Council seat and, crucially, its vast nuclear arsenal. Globally, the Cold War was definitively over, leaving the United States as the world's sole undisputed superpower. This created an immense power vacuum that fundamentally changed the role and the eventual eastward expansion of NATO across Europe. But we have to remember the human element here, too. Economically, the transition for the former Soviet bloc was brutal. The sudden breakdown of these deeply entrenched economic ties triggered a severe crisis. We're talking massive inflation, surging economic inequality, and rising poverty that was, for many folks, actually worse than the Great Depression. The shockwaves of this transition and the newly redrawn borders of Eastern Europe are still actively dictating global politics, alliances, and conflicts that we see today. The evidence we've explored in this explainer paints a really complex picture. We see a superpower undone by a confluence of immense internal decay, coupled with heavy external pressures. So, I want to leave you with this final, thought-provoking question to ponder based on everything we've investigated today. Did the Soviet Union collapse because of its enemies, or because of problems from within?